In early 1979, two communist nations who had spent decades as essentially blood brothers fighting off Western powers, well, they suddenly turned their guns on each other. We are talking about the Socialist Republic of Vietnam and the People's Republic of China.
Right. And if you are listening to this and thinking, wait, weren't China and Vietnam both close communist allies during the Cold War? Well, you are exactly right.
Yeah, that is what makes this moment in history so, deeply shocking. I mean, in a single month, hundreds of thousands of troops clashed across a mountainous border. It resulted in tens of thousands of casualties in a brief, intensely bloody conflict known as the Sino-Vietnamese War.
It is a staggering rupture, and it really forces us to ask a fundamental question about how we read history. We are drawing from a comprehensive historical overview of Sino-Vietnamese relations today to examine this exact explosion of violence.
Exactly. And the core disagreement we have to resolve today is this. Was the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War fundamentally a modern Cold War proxy struggle, driven entirely by 20th century realpolitik and shifting global alliances?
Or, on the flip side, was it actually a modern manifestation of a centuries-old imperial dynamic, where a regional hegemon essentially sought to discipline a historic vassal state?
Right. And I look at the historical record and I see a conflict firmly rooted in the modern era. My position is that the mechanics of 1979 are best understood through the pragmatism of 20th century geopolitics, specifically the massive fracture of the Sino-Soviet split and those cold mechanical balance of power calculations of the Cold War.
And I look at that exact same record and see the unshakable ghost of an ancient empire. I will argue that you simply cannot understand this war without the long arc of history. China's actions in 1979, the language its leaders used, and the way the war ended, they were all direct continuations of an ancient, hierarchical tributary relationship with Vietnam.
Cloaked in modern terminology, I assume.
Yes, it was cloaked in the vocabulary of modern communism, absolutely. But the engine driving it was ancient imperial psychology.
Well, let's start by looking at the actual geopolitical reality of the 20th century, because I think the timeline leading up to 1979 explains the mechanisms of this war perfectly.
Okay, lay it out.
So we have two nations that suffered immensely under Western colonial pressure. Vietnam fell under French colonial rule from 1887 all the way to 1954. China spent that same era navigating catastrophic internal turmoil and foreign encroachment.
Right, the century of humiliation.
Exactly. But after World War II, a powerful, pragmatic, ideological alliance formed. The Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong and the Vietnamese Communists under Ho Chi Minh supported each other. I mean, during the First Indochina War from 1946 to 1954, China was actively funneling weapons, sanctuary, and military advisors to Ho Chi Minh's forces to expel the French.
Which we should note was a massive logistical undertaking for a Chinese state that had literally just finished its own devastating civil war.
It was a massive commitment, yeah. And after the 1954 Geneva Accords divided Vietnam, China backed the Communist North. Throughout the entirety of the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975, China supplied crucial material, anti-aircraft weaponry, and engineering troops to North Vietnam to fight the United States.
They were heavily invested.
Highly invested, but simultaneously, and this is the crucial mechanism, the Soviet Union also became a massive benefactor to Vietnam. And this is where the modern geopolitical engine starts to, rip itself apart. The Sino-Soviet split happened. Beijing and Moscow developed a bitter, paranoid rivalry over who actually led the global communist revolution.
Which completely fractured the communist bloc.
Right. The two largest communist powers on Earth began pointing nuclear weapons at each other across their shared northern border. The ideological unity completely collapsed. It evaporated.
Okay, but how does that lead to China invading Vietnam?
Because when Vietnam finally unified in 1975, they had to make a choice. And their alignment shifted decisively toward the Soviet Union. From Beijing's perspective, Vietnam was no longer a brother in arms. It was suddenly a heavily armed Soviet proxy sitting right on China's vulnerable southern border.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, and the ultimate trigger was Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in December 1978. Vietnam crossed its western border to overthrow the Khmer Rouge, which was a deeply brutal regime, but crucially, it was a regime backed by China. This wasn't ancient history dictating terms. This was a direct, mechanical response to 1970s balance of power shifts. The Cold War map was redrawn overnight, and China reacted militarily.
I come at it from a different way. To look only at the 20th century is to look at a symptom and completely ignore the underlying disease.
A disease, that's strong.
Well, you have to draw upon the deep historical context provided by the material to understand why Beijing reacted with such visceral, personalized outrage. We have to talk about the tributary system. Northern Vietnam was under direct Han Chinese domination from 111 BCE until 938 CE. That is 1,000 years of Chinese rule.
Right, but that was a very long time ago.
It was, but imagine the Roman Empire falling, but its ghost practically and culturally dictating European borders for the next millennium. That period only ended when the Vietnamese general Ngo Nguyen secured independence at the Battle of Bac Dung.
But independence was secured. They broke away.
They broke away physically, yeah, but look at how the geopolitical mechanism functioned for centuries afterward. Under the successive Vietnamese dynasties, the Le, the Chun, and the Lê, Vietnam maintained a strict tributary relationship with China.
Meaning they sent tribute to avoid being invaded again.
Exactly. But it wasn't just a polite exchange of gifts. Think of the tributary system almost like a massive regional protection racket combined with a corporate franchise model. Vietnam was granted autonomy to manage its own internal affairs, but only so long as it recognized the ultimate paternal supremacy of the Chinese emperor.
Okay.
The Vietnamese king literally had to receive a seal of investiture from Beijing to legitimize his rule. Even when the Ming dynasty violently reoccupied Vietnam from 1407 to 1427, which was a deeply traumatic period before they were expelled by Le Loid's rebellion, the overarching paradigm snapped right back to that hierarchical tributary system.
But how does a medieval diplomatic ritual explain armored personnel carriers crossing a border in 1979? I mean, Mao had eradicated the imperial system.
Listen to the rhetoric. When Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping launched the 1979 invasion, he didn't use the language of a modern Cold War strategist. He explicitly stated it was a punitive measure. He announced to the global press that China was going to teach Vietnam a lesson.
Which is certainly a loaded phrase.
Highly loaded. You do not use the phrase teach a lesson in a peer-to-peer, pragmatic Cold War calculus. You use that phrase when a schoolmaster is talking to an unruly student, or when a sovereign is talking to a vassal. By allying with the Soviet Union and invading a Chinese client state in Cambodia, Vietnam wasn't just making a bad geopolitical move. In Beijing's eyes, they were being fundamentally disobedient. Deng Xiaoping was invoking the psychology of an ancient empire disciplining a subordinate who had forgotten their place in the hierarchy.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what triggered the invasion, and particularly how we should interpret Vietnam's move into Cambodia. Let's move away from the idea of emperors and vassals and think about modern security architecture.
All right, I'm listening.
Imagine a modern naval submarine. The survival of that submarine depends entirely on a series of watertight bulkheads. If one bulkhead breaches, the water rushes in, the pressure mounts, and the entire vessel is in existential danger.
That's a vivid analogy.
Right. Well, for China in the late 1970s, Cambodia was a crucial watertight bulkhead on its southern flank.
Even though the Khmer Rouge was violently unstable.
Exactly. Regardless of the Khmer Rouge of domestic atrocities, Beijing viewed them as a necessary strategic buffer against Soviet-aligned Vietnam. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia in December 1978, backed by Soviet logistics, they blew the bulkhead. They took Cambodia completely offline.
And exposed China's southern border?
Exactly. Yes. Suddenly, China found itself entirely surrounded by Soviet influence. The USSR massing troops to the north, and a battle-hardened Soviet-aligned Vietnam dominating the entirety of Indochina to the south. China had to make a countermove to protect its regional interests.
So the teach-a-lesson language was just for show?
The language of teaching a lesson was brilliant domestic and international public relations. It sounded tough and paternal. But the underlying mechanism wasn't about hurt imperial pride. It was cold, hard geopolitical survival. China had to prove to the Soviet Union that Moscow could not simply encircle them without paying a massive bloody price.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Framing this purely as a mechanical Soviet-Chinese proxy war completely strips Vietnam of its own historical agency. And more importantly, it ignores the specific, localized grievances detailed right there in our source material.
You mean the border disputes?
Yes. The text explicitly notes that alongside the Cambodian issue, China was highly motivated by long-standing border tensions and the treatment of ethnic Chinese populations living within Vietnam.
But border skirmishes happen all the time in tense Cold War environments. It doesn't mean it's an imperial reflex.
They do, but we have to ask why these skirmishes escalated into a massive invasion. Vietnam wasn't just acting as a puppet for Moscow. Vietnam was asserting its own regional hegemony in Indochina. They had just defeated the United States military. They had a massive battle-hardened army, and they were consolidating power in Laos and Cambodia.
True. They were very powerful at that moment.
And that is exactly what triggered Beijing's historic psychological anxieties. Viewing Vietnam's growing power purely as a Soviet proxy ignores China's deep-seated historical inability to tolerate a fully autonomous, highly powerful Vietnam on its border.
Because of the ancient hierarchy.
Exactly. For 1,000 years, the foundational rule of the tributary system was that Vietnam could exist, but it could never challenge the regional order or rival the center. By asserting dominance over Indochina, Vietnam was breaking the ancient rules. The border tensions and the disputes over ethnic Chinese populations were just symptoms of this deeper structural offense. China wasn't reacting to a breached submarine bulkhead. It was reacting to a vassal state acting like an equal.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently if we actually look at the military realities on the ground. Let's look at the conduct of the war itself, because the logistics scream of modern tactical doctrine, not ancient ritual.
How so?
We are talking about a highly compressed period of extreme violence, from February 17 to March 16, 1979. The sheer scale is breathtaking. China mobilized and sent a staggering force. Estimates range between 200,000 and 400,000 troops across a highly difficult mountainous border into the northern Vietnamese provinces of Long Son, Cao Bang, and Lao Cai.
And they met fierce resistance?
Incredibly fierce. Vietnam didn't even use its main regular army units at first because they were bogged down in Cambodia. They countered by mobilizing local militias and highly experienced border troops under the strategic leadership of Vladimir Xuan and the legendary General Vong Nguyen Giap.
The fighting was undeniably brutal.
It was, but notice the timeline, because this is the key to the modern strategic mechanism. China crossed the border, engaged in heavy artillery bombardments, captured several key border towns, inflicted massive infrastructural damage, and then, after just 3 weeks, they unilaterally withdrew.
They turned around and walked away?
Exactly, and this wasn't a failure of conquest. It was a highly calculated modern military tactic. It was a limited war designed to achieve specific geopolitical aims. First, they wanted to draw Vietnamese regular forces away from the occupation of Cambodia to relieve pressure on the Khmer Rouge remnants.
Which didn't really work, but I see the intent.
Right. But second, and most importantly, they were testing the limits of the Soviet-Vietnamese Mutual Defense Treaty. Vietnam had just signed a treaty with Moscow basically guaranteeing Soviet protection. By invading Vietnam and then voluntarily pulling back before the Soviet Union could mobilize a massive retaliation on China's northern border, Deng Xiaoping exposed the limits of Soviet guarantees.
He called their bluff.
He proved to the world and to Vietnam that Moscow would not risk World War III to save Hanoi. That is a highly sophisticated 20th century maneuver. You launch a limited strike, achieve strategic deterrence, and pull out before you get trapped in a quagmire.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the bizarre, almost paradoxical outcome of this conflict? Let's look at the actual results on the ground when the dust settled in mid-March.
Okay, let's look at the results.
We are looking at heavy casualties on both sides. The exact numbers are disputed, but we are talking about tens of thousands of young men dead combined in just under a month. And what did it achieve? Neither side secured a decisive strategic gain in terms of territory. The border remains essentially where it was.
But deterrence isn't about territory.
Sure, but most critically for your geopolitical argument, Vietnam maintained its control over Cambodia. They did not pull their main military forces out of Phnom Penh, as Beijing had hoped. They stayed in Cambodia for another decade.
But China still accomplished its goal of exposing the Soviet bluff.
But look at how China processed the end of the war. Despite taking massive casualties, despite failing to alter the physical reality in Cambodia, China officially proclaimed its objectives met and declared victory. To understand why this is so strange, we need to define how modern war is supposed to work.
How do you mean?
Well, in a strictly modern, Clausewitzian view of warfare, where military violence is essentially just a tool to force a political change or conquer territory, this outcome makes absolutely no sense. You do not suffer tens of thousands of casualties, fail to force your enemy out of their conquered territory, and then hold a parade declaring victory.
Unless your objective was never territorial conquest to begin with.
Precisely. It only makes sense if your objective wasn't territorial or strategic in the modern Western sense at all. It only makes sense in the context of ancient tributary optics. The primary goal was the performance of punishment.
The performance of it.
Yes. By penetrating the border, systematically destroying the provincial capitals of Long Son and Kaobong, and then unilaterally deciding to leave on their own timeline, China was projecting its hierarchical authority. The mechanism here is saving face. They were communicating a visceral message. We can enter your house, smash your furniture, and we leave when we decide to, and nobody can stop us.
Reasserting dominance without holding ground?
Exactly. It was about reestablishing the optical supremacy of the northern hegemon. The physical realities in Cambodia were secondary to restoring the psychological hierarchy of the region.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the aftermath of the 1979 war heavily reinforces the primacy of the Cold War structure. If this was really about a performance of punishment and restoring a tributary balance, you would expect the relationship to settle into some kind of restored, albeit tense, imperial harmony once the lesson was taught. But that isn't what happened.
No, it remained incredibly violent.
Exactly. After the Chinese withdrawal in March 1979, the conflict didn't just evaporate. We saw prolonged, highly destructive border clashes continuing throughout the entire decade of the 1980s. The source material highlights the particularly intense artillery duels and trench warfare near Vinh Xuyen in Hà province, peaking around 1984.
Which was an awful meat grinder.
It was a brutal stalemate. And why did this hostility remain frozen in place for over a decade? Because the global structure remained frozen. The Sino-Soviet split persisted, Vietnam remained aligned with Moscow, and China remained deeply opposed.
The geopolitical fault lines didn't move.
Right. But look at what happens the exact moment that global structure shifts. Diplomatic relations between China and Vietnam remained completely severed until 1991. What else happened in 1991? The total collapse of the Soviet Union.
The money dried up.
Completely. The moment the Soviet financial and military backing vanished, Vietnam could no longer afford to sustain its occupation of Cambodia, and they finally withdrew. Furthermore, both China and Vietnam had begun aggressively embracing market-oriented economic reforms. The second the Soviet Union's check started bouncing, the ideological stalemate evaporated.
So you're saying it was purely pragmatic?
The instant the Cold War paradigm collapsed and economic realities took precedence, full diplomatic normalization occurred. The relationship was repaired not because an ancient tributary cycle was finally completed, but because the global economic and political incentives demanded it. They needed trade, they needed stability. This proves that global alignments and hard economics drive the relationship, not the ghosts of the Ming Dynasty.
But the ghost is still sitting at the table, right, up to the present day. Even if we accept that the 1991 normalization was facilitated by the Soviet collapse, look at the modern relations detailed in our text. Yes, post-normalization, economic and political ties gradually improved.
They resolved the land border issues.
They did. The borders were demarcated, landmines were cleared. Today, China is unequivocally Vietnam's largest trading partner. Their economies are deeply integrated. If modern economics and pragmatism were the only driving factors, the relationship should be perfectly harmonious.
But it obviously isn't.
Far from it. Severe friction remains, most notably regarding sweeping territorial claims in the South China Sea, or the East Sea as it is fiercely referred to in Vietnam. We continue to see highly aggressive incidents between Chinese Coast Guard vessels and Vietnamese fishing and exploration ships over these disputed waters.
Which is a major flashpoint today.
It is, and it proves that the ancient dynamic never truly died. Think about the modern context. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is a memory. Both nations share similar political systems and are economically bound to one another. And yet, the fundamental tension remains identical to what it was hundreds of years ago under the Lý and Trần dynasties.
You think Vietnam is still playing the same historical role?
Vietnam is doing exactly what it did in the medieval period. It is actively attempting to balance its fierce, unyielding desire for independence and sovereign control against the looming, inescapable, overarching influence of its northern neighbor. The maritime disputes today are just the newest geography for the absolute oldest psychological dynamic in the region.
I think it's important to summarize where our respective lenses leave us on this history. From my perspective, analyzing the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War, primarily through its 20th century context, remains the most empirically solid and logical approach.
It certainly captures the immediate mechanics.
Yeah, it was a masterclass in brutal Cold War realpolitik. When you track the shifting alliances from the cooperative days of the First Indochina War to the complexities of the Geneva Accords to the ultimate disastrous fracture of the Sino-Soviet split, the 1979 invasion becomes a mechanical, almost inevitable result of the balance of power. Vietnam's move into Cambodia physically threatened China's strategic security architecture, and China responded with a calculated, limited military strike to recalibrate the regional order and test Soviet resolve. It was modern statecraft executed with modern militaries.
And I maintain that the vocabulary used, the execution of the withdrawal, and the highly ambiguous, face-saving conclusion of the conflict reveal the unshakable foundation of an ancient tributary system. 1,000 years of Han Chinese domination, centuries of tributary relations, and deep cultural memories of the Ming occupation created a psychological framework in both Beijing and Hanoi that simply cannot be ignored.
It definitely left a mark.
Absolutely. When a modern leader launches a war specifically to teach a lesson and then declares absolute victory without achieving any tangible strategic shifts, simply because the punishment was administered, you are witnessing the reflexes of an empire disciplining a historic vassal. It was not just a pragmatic response to border shifts. It was an emotional, historical reaction to a perceived loss of hierarchy.
Yet, as vigorously as we can debate these two positions, looking at the entire historical timeline we have explored today, I believe we can find a profound area of convergence.
I agree.
Because if you attempt to isolate the brief, intense violence of February 1979 purely from its deep historical roots, if you just ignore the millennia of Han and Ming interference, you are left wondering why the rhetoric was so distinctly paternalistic, so bitter, and so focused on punishment. But conversely, if you ignore the immediate 20th century catalysts, like the Soviet alliance and the invasion of Cambodia, you simply cannot explain why the conflict erupted at that exact moment in that exact way after decades of communist brotherhood.
Precisely. The complexity of this relationship demands that we use both perspectives simultaneously. Understanding the deep history explains the emotional resonance, the concept of face, and the overarching power dynamics that govern how these two nations view each other, while the modern 20th century timeline explains the specific mechanics of the trigger, the logistical realities of the armies, and the Cold War weaponry used to fight it.
It's all interconnected. We began our discussion today by looking at a sudden, violent rupture between two allies. Is it a modern collision of Cold War tectonic plates, or the eruption of a subterranean imperial dynamic older than recorded memory? Perhaps the truest answer is that the pragmatic tectonic plates of the Cold War could only fracture so violently because they were sitting directly atop a cultural and historical fault line that had been carved out over 2,000 years. We leave it to you to determine which force truly drove the armies across the border in 1979. Thank you for joining us.